The 15th of October, 1950. Wake Island, the Pacific. 0630 hours. On this isolated atoll, 7,000 miles from the continental United States, the air was stifling and humid. A silver Douglas C-54 transport, the presidential aircraft, the Independence, had just touched down on a runway paved with crushed coral. The door opened, and Harry S. Truman emerged at the top of the ramp. He wore his signature double-breasted suit. Despite tropical temperatures nearing 85 degrees, his attire remained as rigorous as if he were in his Washington office. As President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief, he had just flown halfway across the globe. According to military protocol and the dictates of the Constitution, the moment his plane landed, his subordinates should have been lined up on the tarmac to salute him. Yet Truman looked out upon an empty runway. In that minute, no one came forward. Through his thick-lensed glasses, Truman gazed a few hundred yards away. There sat a jeep. Inside sat General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur. He wore his trademark Philippine field marshal's cap, heavy with gold braid, and a corncob pipe was clamped in his teeth. He was casually checking his watch. This was not a logistical error. Secret Service agents present at the scene later recalled the atmosphere becoming excruciatingly stiff during that long minute. MacArthur showed no sign of exiting the jeep. He was waiting. He was waiting for the President of the United States to walk down the ramp, cross the tarmac, and come to him. Truman later recorded this moment in his private diary. "He's playing a psychological game with me. I think he'll soon find out who's calling the shots." But at that moment, for the sake of the bigger picture, Truman chose to compromise. He walked down the ramp. This scene was described by historian David McCullough as one of the most fragile moments in American democracy. It was not merely a personal contest between two leaders, but a collision of two distinct concepts of power at the forefront of the Cold War. One representing the elected civilian government constrained by the Constitution. The other, a decorated military commander wielding nearly absolute power in the Far East. Just as the two men shook hands, thousands of miles away in the northern reaches of the Korean Peninsula, on the north bank of the Yalu River, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were massing under the cover of darkness. A storm that would not only alter the fates of these two men, but also reshape the Cold War, was set to erupt in 4 days. To understand the awkwardness on Wake Island, one must return to the historical context of 1950. At that time, Douglas MacArthur was, in a sense, no longer just a soldier. Since the Japanese surrender in 1945, he had served as the supreme commander for the Allied powers. In Tokyo, he resided in the Daiichi Life Building, wielding more actual ruling power than the Emperor of Japan. He drafted the Japanese Constitution, implemented land reform, and granted women the right to vote. To the Japanese public, he was the blue-eyed shogun who had restored order from the ruins. Long removed from the political checks and balances of Washington, and bolstered by his immense World War II prestige, MacArthur had gradually succumbed to an illusion. He believed he was the ultimate arbiter, not only of military matters, but of American geostrategy in Asia. By contrast, Harry Truman's position was starkly different. He was viewed by many political elites as the accidental heir following President Roosevelt's death. He possessed no distinguished lineage, no university degree, and had once gone bankrupt running a haberdashery, rising instead through the machinery of Missouri grassroots politics. To the Washington establishment, he lacked Roosevelt's polish and charisma in handling global affairs. This vast disparity in background led to a fundamental divergence in strategic judgment. After the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, this divergence was rapidly amplified. MacArthur advocated for traditional total victory, using America's overwhelming military advantage to thoroughly destroy the adversary. Truman, his Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff JCS were playing a more complex game. On Truman's desk lay top-secret briefings from the CIA. The Soviet Union was massing heavy forces in Eastern Europe. White House strategists were convinced that the Korean Peninsula was likely just a Stalinist feint. If the main body of the U.S. military became bogged down on the Asian mainland, the Red Army might seize the opportunity to sweep across Western Europe. Consequently, Truman formulated the principle of limited war under the broader strategy of containment, strictly limiting objectives to restoring the 38th parallel and avoiding direct military conflict with China or the Soviet Union. To MacArthur, this restraint was a sign of weakness. In private correspondence with Republican allies, he repeatedly expressed disdain for this strategy of war without victory. This tension was temporarily alleviated in September 1950 because MacArthur once again proved his military genius. With U.S. forces compressed into the desperate perimeter of Pusan, MacArthur proposed the Incheon landing. It was a plan considered impossible in military textbooks. Incheon possessed some of the world's most extreme tidal variations and massive seawalls. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the JCS, had privately remarked that the operation was tantamount to suicide, but MacArthur overruled the dissenters. At the strategic briefing, he delivered a famous closing line: "The Navy has never let me down." On September 15, the Incheon landing succeeded. North Korean supply lines were severed, and the course of the war reversed within 24 hours. This victory not only salvaged the war effort, but also propelled MacArthur's prestige to its zenith. The skeptics in Washington were silenced. Even Truman had to admit that the old general had earned the right to be arrogant. It was with this aura of victory from Incheon that MacArthur arrived at Wake Island. At this moment, he was convinced that his judgment of the Asian theater was superior to anyone in Washington. The core of the Wake Island meeting was not, as the public speculated, a victory celebration, but an intelligence confirmation. Inside a stark, corrugated metal building where only a single fan whirred against the heat, Truman took off his glasses, looked directly at MacArthur, and asked the question haunting the White House: "General, what are the chances for Chinese or Soviet interference?" It was a formal presidential inquiry. The stenographer recorded MacArthur's response. Even read today, the words are filled with a disquieting confidence. MacArthur put down his pipe and spoke with steady assurance. "Mr. President, very little. Had they interfered in the first or second months, it would have been decisive. But now, we are no longer fearful of their intervention." He continued his analysis. "The Chinese have 300,000 men in Manchuria. Of these, probably not more than 100,000 are distributed along the Yalu River. They have no air force. Now that we have bases for our air force in Korea, if the Chinese tried to get down to Pyongyang, there would be the greatest slaughter." He concluded, "I believe that organized resistance will end by Thanksgiving. I think our boys can be home by Christmas." Home by Christmas. This phrase greatly reassured Truman. Since the commander on the ground was so certain, the White House approved the plan to continue the advance north, even allowing U.S. forces to approach the Sino-Korean border. However, this was a catastrophic miscalculation born of hubris. In reality, at the very moment MacArthur gave his guarantee, Beijing had already made its decision. Mao Zedong, in a telegram to Stalin, made it clear that China could not sit idly by while a neighbor was completely occupied. On October 19, 4 days after the Wake Island meeting, the 13th Army Corps of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army began crossing the Yalu River under strict radio silence. MacArthur's intelligence agencies were not entirely blind. U.S. reconnaissance planes had reported signs of heavy smoke and vehicle movements along the border. But the Tokyo Command, intoxicated by the victory at Incheon, interpreted this intelligence as a small number of volunteers or token defensive forces. MacArthur remained convinced that no nation would dare challenge the firepower of the U.S. Army without air superiority. It was this cognitive bias that led the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division and the 1st Marine Division to march, unprepared, into the rugged mountains of the Chosin Reservoir and the Chongchon River. In late November, MacArthur's promised home-by-Christmas offensive began. American soldiers ate turkey, believing this was their final march. However, as night fell and temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, the shrill sound of bugles shattered the silence. It was not a few thousand men, but hundreds of thousands. Utilizing night attacks and close-quarters combat, Chinese forces severed the overextended American columns. Units considered the elite of the U.S. military suddenly found themselves divided and encircled. Telegrams sent from the front to Washington shifted rapidly from confidence to panic. In an urgent cable to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, MacArthur's tone underwent a violent shift. "We face an entirely new war." But rather than examining his intelligence failures, he quickly turned his fury toward Washington. He publicly demanded an expansion of the war, bombing air bases in Manchuria, implementing a naval blockade, and even though not stated publicly, it was mentioned in top-secret memoranda considering the use of nuclear weapons. For Truman, the worst nightmare had materialized. MacArthur was attempting to drag the United States into a full-scale war with China at the very moment the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance was in effect. If the United States attacked Chinese soil, the Soviet Union would have not only the reason but the legal obligation to enter the war. This was no longer a question of how to win the Korean War, but how to avoid World War III. And in this moment of extreme peril, MacArthur made a move that not only violated military discipline, but challenged the very baseline of the Constitution. He decided to bypass the president and appealed directly to the American public and opposition party leaders. Here is the translation of the second part of the narrative, continuing the professional history style. By December 1950, the situation on the Korean Peninsula was catastrophic for American forces. Following the devastating setbacks at the Chosin Reservoir and the Changchun River, United Nations forces were compelled to execute a full-scale withdrawal to the south. The American press dubbed this humiliating retreat the Big Bug Out. Seoul fell once again. In Tokyo, MacArthur's mood darkened into fatalism. In cables to Washington, he employed deeply pessimistic rhetoric, asserting that unless he was authorized to bomb China's coastal industrial zones, blockade its coastline, and introduce nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan, evacuation from the peninsula was only a matter of time. He wrote, "There is no hope of a decisive result in this restricted war." However, the turning point on the battlefield came not from expanding the war, but from the appointment of a new commander. On the 23rd of December 1950, Lieutenant General Walton Walker, commander of the 8th Army, was killed in a jeep accident. The Pentagon immediately dispatched Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, to take command. Ridgway was the antithesis of MacArthur. He did not command from the detached heights of Tokyo. He flew directly to the front lines. His inspections revealed that the primary issue plaguing American forces was not a lack of manpower, but a road-bound mentality and a collapse in morale. Ridgway ordered troops off the roads and onto the ridgelines. He implemented the meat grinder tactic, utilizing superior U.S. artillery to inflict maximum casualties on Chinese forces rather than prioritizing the capture of territory. Through Operation Killer and Operation Ripper in February and March 1951, Ridgway miraculously stabilized the front and recaptured Seoul. The line of contact once again settled near the 38th parallel. This tactical success had profound implications for decision-making in Washington. It proved MacArthur's judgment wrong. The United States did not need to expand the war or employ nuclear weapons to hold the line. This allowed the Truman administration to solidify its ultimate strategic objective, status quo ante bellum. Since communist forces had been pushed back north of the 38th parallel, the U.S. could now seek a ceasefire and pivot its focus back to the defense of Europe. But to MacArthur, such a stalemate was anathema. In his view, a war that did not end in the total defeat of the enemy was not merely a military failure, but moral appeasement. In March 1951, President Truman and his advisors drafted a crucial presidential statement. Given that the front had stabilized and Chinese forces had suffered heavy casualties, the White House believed the moment was ripe to open armistice negotiations. The draft was exceedingly cautious, designed to signal to Beijing and Pyongyang that the UN command was willing to discuss terms. As a matter of protocol, the top-secret draft was sent to Tokyo for the theater commander's review. It was a courtesy to the five-star general, but also a tacit instruction: do not launch major new offensives that might disrupt the diplomatic atmosphere. MacArthur's response was not merely a rejection, it was a preemptive strike. On the 24th of March 1951, days before Truman intended to release his statement, MacArthur issued a communique from Tokyo in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command. It was not a routine military situation report, but a threatening ultimatum. MacArthur taunted China's industrial capacity and openly declared, "The enemy must by now be painfully aware that a decision of the United Nations to depart from its tolerant effort to contain the war to the area of Korea through an expansion of our military operations to its coastal areas and interior bases would doom Red China to the risk of imminent military collapse." Even more egregiously, he bypassed the president entirely to address the enemy leadership. "I stand ready at any time to confer in the field with the commander-in-chief of the enemy forces in an earnest effort to find any military means whereby the realization of the political objectives of the United Nations might be accomplished." In Washington, this was viewed as a direct assault on constitutional authority. Under the U.S. Constitution, the power of diplomacy resides solely with the executive branch. For a theater commander to issue an unauthorized ultimatum to an enemy nation and attempt to dictate the terms of negotiation constituted, in any modern state, a usurpation of power. Truman's memoirs later recorded his fury. He viewed this not as mere recklessness, but as deliberate political sabotage. MacArthur was effectively telling Beijing, "Ignore that weak president in Washington. If you do not surrender on my terms, I will escalate the war." This act directly caused China to reject the possibility of peace talks, prolonging the war for another 2 years. If the communiqué of March 24 was the fuse, the event of April 5 was the detonation. That afternoon, House Minority Leader Joseph Martin, a Republican, read a letter aloud on the floor of the House of Representatives. It was a response written to him by MacArthur on March 20. At the time, Republicans were fiercely attacking Truman's containment policy and Europe First strategy, advocating instead for the opening of a second front using nationalist Chinese troops. Martin had written to MacArthur asking for his views, a blatant political trap. As an active duty officer, MacArthur should have avoided such partisan entanglements. Instead, he jumped in with both feet. In the letter, MacArthur publicly endorsed the radical Republican position, criticized the Truman administration's policies, and penned a concluding line that was nothing short of incendiary. "Here in Asia, we fight Europe's war with arms, while the diplomats there still fight it with words. If we lose the war to communism in Asia, the fall of Europe is inevitable. As you pointed out, we must win. There is no substitute for victory." The publication of this letter meant MacArthur was no longer just a dissenting general. He had become a political weapon wielded by the opposition against the sitting president. This was a direct violation of military regulations regarding public criticism of government policy by active duty personnel. Friday, the 6th of April, 1951. The West Wing. Truman convened his inner circle. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley, and Special Advisor W. Averill Harriman. The gravity of the meeting was palpable. They were not discussing the dismissal of a mere general, but the firing of a national icon. Meeting records indicate that even Truman's closest allies hesitated. Secretary of Defense Marshall requested time to review all of MacArthur's correspondence from the past 2 years. As MacArthur's former superior, Marshall needed to determine if this was a pattern of insubordination 1N. General Bradley worried that the move would trigger mutiny within the military or destroy morale at the front. However, after 2 days of archival review, the military leadership's stance shifted. The Joint Chiefs of Staff reached a consensus. From a strictly military perspective, MacArthur's conduct had become too intolerable. He was not only disobeying orders, but, more critically, he was no longer in alignment with Washington's strategic objectives. On April 9, Bradley reported the military's conclusion to Truman: "If we do not fire him, we will lose control of the Army." Truman wrote in his diary, "I could no longer tolerate this insubordination, no matter what the political consequences might be." The dismissal process itself was a chaotic comedy of errors. The White House originally planned for Secretary of the Army Frank Pace, who was in Korea, to fly to Tokyo and personally deliver the order to preserve MacArthur's dignity. However, due to a communications failure, Pace did not receive the cable in time. Meanwhile, on the evening of April 10, White House Press Secretary Joseph Short received word that Walter Trohan, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, had caught wind of the story and was preparing to run a "MacArthur to be purged" exclusive the following morning. To prevent the narrative from being leaked and distorted by a hostile press, Truman decided to act immediately. At 1 a.m. Washington time on April 11, a hastily arranged press conference was held at the White House. Reporters were handed a cold, mimeographed statement. "With deep regret, I have concluded that General of the Army Douglas MacArthur is unable to give his wholehearted support to the policies of the United States government and of the United Nations." In Tokyo, it was lunchtime. MacArthur was entertaining guests, including Senator Warren Magnuson, at the American Embassy. His aide, Colonel Sidney Huff, heard the news broadcast over a commercial radio playing in the background. Pale-faced, Huff entered the dining room and whispered into MacArthur's ear. According to witnesses, MacArthur's expression did not change. He paused for a moment, then turned to his wife and said, "Jeannie, we're going home." There was no official cable, no presidential envoy. The five-star general who had ruled Japan for 5.5 years and commanded the largest campaigns of World War II learned of his firing via a commercial radio broadcast. Although Truman anticipated backlash, he vastly underestimated the ferocity of the public's rage. On the morning of April 11, as newspapers hit doorsteps across America, public opinion exploded. In the Capitol, Republican Senator William Jenner declared, "This country is today in the hands of a secret inner coterie, which is directed by agents of the Soviet Union." The Texas state legislature passed a resolution calling Truman a fellow traveler of the communists. In San Gabriel, California, an effigy of Truman was publicly burned. The White House mailroom received 78,000 telegrams and letters in 24 hours. The overwhelming majority were abusive. It was not just a collapse in approval ratings. Truman's numbers sank to 22%. It was a schism in the American psyche regarding who truly represented the nation. To the public of that era, MacArthur represented victory, honor, and anti-communist resolve. Truman was painted as a petty politician who was not only weak but perhaps even treacherous. On April 17, MacArthur landed in San Francisco to a welcome by 500,000 people. On April 19, he delivered his famous farewell address to a joint session of Congress. When he spoke in that aged, magnetic voice, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," legislators openly wept. The thunderous applause that shook the Capitol seemed to sound the death knell for Truman's political career. In the battle for public perception, Truman had lost completely. He sat alone in the White House, isolated and reviled. But he held one final card, a card he had not yet played, the truth. While MacArthur's speech was moving, in the upcoming congressional hearings, the general would have to face factual interrogation under oath, and it was those facts that would ultimately reverse the judgment of history. The 3rd of May, 1951, Washington. Just 2 weeks after MacArthur delivered his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech on Capitol Hill, the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees, chaired by Senator Richard Russell, opened a joint inquiry. Unlike the general's public address, this was a closed-door hearing, though heavily redacted transcripts were later released. Here, there was no applause, only sworn testimony. Republicans had initially hoped to use the hearings to humiliate the Truman administration and prove that the dismissal was a grievous error rooted in appeasement. However, as the highest-ranking U.S. military leaders took the stand one by one, the situation underwent a dramatic reversal. The first to give critical testimony was General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a 5-star general who had commanded the largest U.S. forces in World War II. Bradley was known for his steady demeanor. When asked whether the U.S. should follow MacArthur's advice and expand the war onto the Chinese mainland, Bradley offered the strategic assessment that would be quoted for decades. He used no emotional language, but stated from a global strategic perspective. Frankly, in the opinion of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this strategy would involve us in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Bradley elaborated that America's strategic priority was the defense against the Soviet Union. At the time, the Soviets had 175 divisions deployed in Eastern Europe, while the U.S. and its allies had fewer than 30 inches Western Europe. If the main force of the U.S. military were consumed by MacArthur in Asia, the Soviets could easily sever America's strategic arteries. Following him, Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg provided specific data. He testified that the current size of the U.S. Strategic Air Command could not simultaneously sustain a full-scale bombing campaign against Chinese industrial bases and maintain nuclear deterrence against the Soviet Union. "We could destroy the Chinese cities," Vandenberg stated coolly, "but then we would be naked tomorrow to Soviet nuclear attack." These testimonies, like surgical strikes, stripped away the strategic blind spots beneath MacArthur's substitute for victory doctrine. While the public knew MacArthur wanted to expand the war, it was not until years later, through declassified archives and interviews given late in his life, that people discovered how truly extreme his specific tactical planning was. In an informal interview after his dismissal and later in conversations with reporter Bob Considine, MacArthur detailed how he would have ended the war if allowed. He planned to drop 30 to 50 atomic bombs, but he did not intend to merely target cities. His concept was to use the weapons along the Yalu River, the border between China and North Korea, to create an interdiction belt laced with the highly radioactive isotope cobalt-60. MacArthur's own words were chilling. It would have created a belt of radioactive cobalt from the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea. For at least 60 to 120 years, the area would have been rendered uninhabitable for any living thing. It would have physically cut off all terrestrial passage into Korea from the north. This was no longer war in the traditional sense, nor even conventional nuclear deterrence. It was the ultimate expression of a scorched earth policy, the deliberate creation of a centuries-long uninhabitable wasteland. Though the Truman administration did not publicly release this detail at the time, they were well aware of the insanity of the proposal. If the U.S. had implemented this plan, it would have been morally bankrupt. Losing all European allies, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee flew to Washington specifically to express his horror over the potential use of nuclear weapons, and almost certainly triggering direct Soviet intervention in World War III. As the hearings progressed, the 2 million words of testimony gradually permeated the public consciousness. American public opinion began to cool from its initial fever pitch. People started to realize that the fundamental nature of this conflict was not a struggle between hawks and doves, but a crisis over the survival of American constitutional principles. Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution explicitly states, "The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States." The core logic of this design is that the military serves as the instrument of national policy, not its formulator. No matter how high a general's reputation or how brilliant his accomplishments, he must ultimately submit to the political decisions of the elected president. Historian H.W. Brands observed, had Truman failed to fire MacArthur, he would have effectively conceded that military authority could supersede the Constitution. America would have transitioned from a nation governed by law to one governed by the will of its military, much like the Roman Republic slid into empire. Truman later wrote in a letter, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the office of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not why. I fired him because he was opposing the Constitution." The 20th of January 1953, as Dwight Eisenhower, another five-star general, was being sworn in on Capitol Hill, Harry Truman quietly left Washington. There was no grand send-off. His approval rating still lingered near the historical low of 22%. He and his wife Bess boarded a train and returned home to Independence, Missouri. His life in retirement was, for a time, financially constrained. There was no presidential pension at the time. He refused lucrative board positions from major corporations, stating he didn't want to commercialize the title of president. It was not until years later that Congress passed legislation granting former presidents a pension. He spent his days walking in his small town, living the life of an ordinary citizen. When tourists asked him why he made those unpopular decisions in Korea, he would invariably point to the small sign on his desk, "The buck stops here." This phrase meant that the chain of decision-making terminates with the president. All blame, all difficulty, and all consequences must be borne by the president alone and cannot be passed to anyone else. Time is the best judge, but it often takes decades to render its verdict. In the years following Truman's departure, as Cold War archives were declassified, historians began to reevaluate his legacy. The Marshall Plan and NATO. He rebuilt Europe and established the collective defense system that remains operational today. Containment. He found a crucial middle path between MacArthur's call for hot war and isolationism. This strategy, though tedious, costly, and time-consuming, successfully averted nuclear catastrophe and eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet system. Establishment of limited war. His restraint in Korea established a vital principle for the nuclear age that conflicts between great powers must be contained within the scope of conventional war and not easily escalated to total war. In rankings by C-SPAN and other authoritative bodies, Truman steadily climbed from the failure status of 1,953. In most rankings since 2000, he consistently ranks in the top 10, often listed as a near-great president, alongside Lincoln, Washington, and Roosevelt. MacArthur remains a military genius. His Inchon gamble is still recognized as a tactical masterpiece, but his short-sightedness as a strategist and statesman has also been laid bare by time. In October 1950, on that humid morning on Wake Island, when Douglas MacArthur made the president wait, he believed he represented strength. But history proved that true strength does not stem from medals, public acclaim, or arrogant self-confidence. Genuine strength came from an ordinary man who, under immense pressure, adhered to principle, respected the Constitution, and had the courage to shoulder the blame for the sake of a longer, more fragile peace. Truman won, not because he defeated MacArthur, but because he successfully defended something far more important than personal honor.